Thank you. I think I have some questions that I'll try and sort of bring together because I think they address common themes. So the first one, I think Amaka, you asked why didn't we give capping in terms of the capacity. So the way there was a lot of discussion about this at the PTF meeting. It generated heated discussions. But the thing to remember is when we say limiting capacity, it's all about ensuring physical distancing. So a lot of mosques, for instance, I'll give you an example. There are mosques that carry only maybe 20 persons. So if we say a limit of 50, that's way beyond what you would expect. There are places that may take 6,000, 7,000 people for church worship, for instance. So if we say a limit of 50, the physical distancing, there will still be a lot of space left. And if we look at the scientific side and say, well, why don't we just say a third of the capacity? Well, what about 50%? If it's a large area, they will still be able to maintain physical distancing. So which is why we decided that let the state authorities decide for each place of worship, or across the board, they may come out and say it shouldn't exceed a third capacity for that state across the board, and that will be fine. But they are the ones that will be doing the enforcement, and we expect them to limit capacity. That's the thing. We expect them to make sure that physical distancing measures apply, whatever formula they use, that those physical distancing measures apply. One of the advantages of places of worship and religious institutions is that they are probably one of the most organized of all the institutions we have. They have leadership, they have volunteers, and they have processes for enforcement. So if a state, just like Lagos, for instance, are registering premises, if they decide they can register places of worship, tick them off and say, yes, this has been agreed with the leadership of those places of worship. These are the conditions you have to abide by. We have checked and you're okay. You can start providing those services. It's possible. But it's very difficult for us to impose general measures that are very prescriptive at the federal level on all states. States will have to take some degree of responsibility because they are the ones that will enforce these rules. So that's why we said capacity, this is the condition we are giving. You have to maintain physical distancing. And if you keep that physical distancing, then you can decide what the capacity will be. One of the recommendations we made, for instance, was to consider people coming in cars and staying, rather than going into enclosed spaces, staying within themselves in cars and attending church services. So that's unique. That's something that is being practiced outside the country, for instance, and nothing stops some of our places of worship, particularly churches, for instance, delivering services in this way. There was a question about registers. I did make it clear that where possible, and this applies particularly to setups like churches. It may be more difficult in mosques where people come and leave fairly quickly. But where we want the registers is particularly where it deals with the staffing, because they are the ones that are there all the time and they are the ones that will be most exposed. So for places of worship where they have staffing and volunteers, they make sure they have a full contact list with contact addresses, etc., so that if there's an outbreak, we'll be able to get on top of it fairly quickly. For places of worship that are very organized and are able to keep registers, fine. But these are advisories. We don't expect every place of worship to provide that service. There will be guidelines, there will be advisories, there will be recommendations, there will be different levels of guidance available. Enforcement of guidelines, I think, as I said earlier, what we are providing is a baseline for states. States may wish not to even open places of worship. But if they do, we expect them to at least, at a minimum, ensure that those baseline guidance that we have given are followed so that people can be safe. And if they wish to strengthen those guidelines and say, no, capacity 20%, that's still okay. Or we're not going to admit children and we're not going to admit those above the age of 55, 60. That's still within their remit. But we do expect some degree of enforcement, and we expect the local authorities to work very closely with religious leaders to make sure these guidelines are abided by. Flights. So when do international flights resume? Can we give some sort of idea? Well, I'm afraid we have to crawl before we run. We're sorting out domestic flights first. We've given a timeline. When we said 21st June, as I said yesterday, we didn't say 21st June, suddenly all planes will be up in the sky. We are giving the aviation industry the next 3 weeks to get their act together and to prepare. And once they do, they can get in contact with us, and if everything is okay, we'll give them the go-ahead anytime from the 21st of June. If they come back to us in a week's time and say they are ready, then they are on their own, of course. But all we are saying is we give you 3 weeks to prepare. After those 3 weeks, any time beyond those 3 weeks, we can sign off if they are ready. And as I said yesterday, you cannot have interstate restrictions and allow domestic flights. The two do not match. So where we review and allow domestic flights, we will have to review the restrictions on interstate movement as well. And that will be done. I think the other thing had to do with 20 local government areas contributing 60% of cases. So I think DG and CDC has already addressed this, but I just wanted to say that we are preparing a package of interventions for those hotspots, and this will include increased testing, identifying isolation facilities, improving case management in those areas, and making sure that people are aware that they live within a high-risk area and they need to apply strict enforcement in terms of the way they behave. And we are also looking at the possibility of precision lockdowns for those local governments. And finally, there was something finally. Oh yes, Gavi. Is Nigeria contributing anything to the funding for vaccine? So the way Gavi operates is very similar to the Global Fund. Countries provide counterpart funding across the board for services. You don't provide counterpart funding just for one specific disease condition. So when it came to Gavi in June 2018, just about 2 years ago, Nigeria provided its $1.8 billion counterpart funding for 10 years to enable vaccines, childhood vaccines, to be provided. As far as I know, the COVID vaccine is being mostly funded through other sources such as the US government or Gates Foundation, etc. Nigeria has not contributed to this. Thank you.